Hello everybody, welcome to my office. My stuffed John F. Kennedy doll over there, my Laker basketball over there. I'm bringing you into my office today in order to talk to you about the way we respond to poems in a creative writing workshop. And so what I want you to do is make sure you've got a copy of this. I just attached it to the same video that you're watching. This is a series of how to respond to a poem in a workshop. And I've got several different categories, 9 of them all together, and a series of questions that will relate to each of those categories. And I want to go through each one. So I'm going to read those questions and you can follow along, but then I'm also going to elaborate the points that I'm making to help further illustrate the points that we're getting across here. So the first thing that I've got on here is purpose. All writing has a purpose, right? I mean, we're taught that in composition classes. Everything you write has a reason for being written. And the way I want you to think about these questions is you've got a workshop poem, or you're reading a poem from somebody else, and it's very intimidating to know how to begin to respond to it, especially with anything more substantial and useful than a I like it, or I don't know, I kind of like it. So the first thing I want to think about is, what is the purpose of this poem that you're looking at? Why does this poem exist? The person who has written this poem had a reason for writing it. Do we know what it is? Is it a clear thing? Is it a clear explanation of a certain event in the poet's life? Is it about something that doesn't feel urgent? And if it doesn't, maybe the purpose isn't as clear as it could be. So that's the first question. What is the point of the poem? What is the purpose of the poem? And that relates to the next question that's on the list, is what is the writer trying to accomplish? That might not be a clear sort of narrative purpose. It might not just be something like this poet wants to come to terms with this point in her life, or this poet is trying to understand this thing that's going on over here. It might be the purpose of this poem, the writer's trying to accomplish something that is lyrically engaging or is visually interesting. It could be something else, but I want to see if you can articulate exactly what the writer's trying to accomplish in these moments. What do you think the piece is actually accomplishing? That's separate from what the poet is trying to accomplish. Maybe I'm trying to write a poem that explains my feelings about this event that took place, or I'm trying to understand my place in the universe. But maybe the poem itself isn't actually doing that. So is there a disconnect between what the poet is trying to do and what the poem's actually accomplishing? And is that bad, or is that okay? Because it might be okay. There are times in which the purpose of the poem feels separate from what's actually happening in the poem. And that might be interesting. In fact, it might sort of create a conflict. Maybe I'm trying to say one thing, but the poem itself is kind of pushing back. That's interesting. So what's the poem trying to accomplish? Is it accomplishing that? And what does this poem need to say? Is there something that this poem absolutely needs to say, and is it saying that? And by that, I mean not just what the purpose of the poem is, but what's the urgency that's driving this poem. Think about that. You know, we've got that refrigerator poem that we looked at last week and that you wrote imitations of, which have been a blast to read, by the way. Thank you. And I love the feedback you guys are giving one another. That's fantastic. But that poem ostensibly is about nostalgia. It's about looking back. It's about kind of looking at one's childhood. But it needs to say something else. And it's needing to say something about a thing that ended up mattering more than it needed to, and how that affected the speaker. That rips one's heart with joy that the poem talks about. That's what the poem needs to say, and it eventually gets there. And is a poem that you're reading in workshop, is it saying as much as it needs to? Is it saying those urgent things that really need to get across? So that's purpose. What's the point of the poem? And what I want you to think about these questions in terms of acknowledging workshop and looking at other people's work in a workshop. Obviously, they're going to matter in your own work too. If you've written a poem and you kind of like it, but you look back and you go, yeah, I don't know what it's for, I don't know why it matters, then maybe we need to reevaluate it going forward. So the next section is about sound, and we're going to learn so much more about sound as we go on, because we're going to talk a lot more about a lot of the things that are especially in the Mary Oliver handbook, although some things that are also in the Ted Kooser book. But we're going to talk a ton about sound. And the first thing that I've got on here is not a question in the sound section, but it is a piece of advice, a direction, an order. I don't usually want to be quite that forceful, but read it out loud, if feasible. If you are doing all of your workshop work in the in the calf or somewhere public and you don't feel comfortable with that, then don't. But you got time with these. You'll have like a week with these. And so read it out loud. This is important. As we talked about in class last week, amongst the many, many, many definitions of what a poem is, to me, it's a verbal expression, maybe more than anything else. So read that poem aloud. Think about what it sounds like. How does it sound? And by that I mean, what story is it telling with just the sounds? This is separate from whatever the narrative or the purpose is, but how does it sound? Think of ways this piece could sound better. Is it working musically in a certain way? Is it relying too much on a certain technique? Is it not doing enough with certain techniques? Think about those things. What is it doing to create a distinct sound? What about this poem makes it stand out from poems? What distinct thing is it doing? That doesn't mean that every poem has to be this unique creation. It just means that this poem should be doing something with sound that is creating something distinct. The next part of that question is it trying too hard? Sometimes we might be working to create such a distinct sound that it feels gimmicky. It feels like the rhythm, the narration, the narration of the poem is being dictated by rhyme. We don't want that. So what's the poem doing to sound distinct, and is it trying too hard, potentially? The next thing I ask you to do is think of Koch's two languages. I'm talking about a book by Kenneth Koch that I have not required in class, but we'll talk about a little bit. It's called Making Your Own Days by Kenneth Koch. We shared a quote from him in class last week. Remember, poetry is often regarded as a mystery, and in many ways, and in some respects, it is one. No one is quite sure where poetry comes from. No one is quite sure exactly what it is, and no one knows really how anyone is able to write it. I shared that in class last week. I like it enough. I want to read it again. But he talks in his book here about the two languages. And the two languages that he's talking about are the poetic language and the day-to-day language. And the example that he uses here is the poetic language. Here's the phrase, 2 and 2 are rather blue. And he says, no, one may say. 2 and 2 are 4. And is he right? Well, yeah, this is not a math class, but I think we can safely agree that that's right. Yeah, 2 and 2 are 4, but that is another language. In the poetry language, it's true that 2 and 2 are rather green has little or no meaning, but 2 and 2 are rather blue does have meaning. It has meaning through sound. So when we talk about the poetry language, it's like a language that can be given meaning through sound that is appealing to the ear. So when we say 2 and 2 are rather blue, that's more interesting than 2 or 2 are rather green, because that doesn't have any meaning to it. But the rhyme kind of creates something else. If you can start to make 2 or 2 are rather teal, might have some meaning to it too, because that alliteration of the T's is hitting on something. So I'm not saying that we have to use rhyme, we have to use extensive alliteration, but there are things that we can get away with in poetry language that you just can't get away with in normal everyday speech. Again, think of the refrigerator poem from Tom Lux that we read last week. That section where he's repeating the word hot or red over and over again with all the different meanings. If I were to just say that in normal conversation, I would look a little bit odd. But in the poem it doesn't, because it's building momentum, it's building energy. That's poetry language. So when I say the two languages, that's what I mean. The everyday language that we use, and then this poetry language that we use in our poems that allows us to do things that are a little bit outside of normal speech. Okay. Does the poem, whatever poem you're workshopping and looking at, does it feel like it's capturing that second language? You don't want, generally speaking, a poem that feels too attached to normal speech. That's what other forms of writing are for. If a poem feels like it's just normal speech, then it feels like it has less a reason to be a poem. As we talked about last time, there's always an exception to a poem. A poem is supposed to sound like blank, unless it doesn't. Remember, I did that for a while. And so that's the same thing here. A poem has to sound like a poem, but it shouldn't sound like it's trying to sound like a poem. And I think the more we read this semester, the more we'll get a sense of that as we go on. So we've talked about purpose. We've talked about sound. Now let's talk about opening and closing. Does this piece begin and end as effectively as it could? Look at the beginning and the end of the poem pretty specifically. How is this poem beginning and ending? Is this poem beginning in a way that grabs you? We'll talk more about that in a second. Is it ending in a place that feels like the right ending? And sometimes the right ending doesn't mean that it feels like an ending. Sometimes it might feel like it's not an ending. Sometimes, to me, a poem might end so completely that I'm left unsatisfied. It feels like there's too much closure. So is this poem providing too much closure, or is it providing too little? So, in the beginning, is the beginning later in the piece than it actually begins? Or is it too early? Now here's what I mean by that. Is the beginning later in the piece than it actually begins? Does this poem need to begin at a different place? So when you look at the opening line of the poem, is that where the opening line should be? Or should the opening line be 4 lines down? This happens to us sometimes, that we're starting to write our poems and we write our way to the actual opening line, but it's about 6 lines deep because we're trying to get to it. That's hard for us as the writers of the piece to see. That's where the workshop comes in, because you can see my poem in a different way. You see my poem not as it's supposed to be, but as it actually is. And so if I can look at a poem and think, those first 6 lines are okay, but here's where the poem starts. This is the opening line. And then as the writer, I'll look at it and I'll think, now, oh yeah, you're totally right. Or does the poem need to begin earlier than where it is? Are there a few lines that haven't been written yet that will get me into the world of the poem? Don't just assume that the poem is beginning in the spot where it needs to begin. We might end up making all sorts of suggestions on where to move things and twist things and turn things around. A poem begins in a spot in the draft that we're looking at. That doesn't necessarily mean that's where it's going to end. Is the ending where it's supposed to be? Sometimes we'll find an ending in the middle of the poem and we'll move it down. Sometimes a poem is 5 lines too long and those lines just get cut. If you ever cut something like this too, if let's say you're writing a poem and it's suggested to you that this is a 20-line poem, but line 16, that's where it ends. This is the last line, and then you'll say, well, what do I do with those other 4 lines? Those are good, I like them. Well, maybe they don't exist in this poem. Sometimes you have to cut good lines to make a good poem better. And it feels counterintuitive, it feels weird, but sometimes we just do. What I do when I have to cut those lines out is I will go ahead and open another file and just throw extra lines in there. Maybe those lines, if they are good, can begin something else, but maybe they didn't quite work with this poem. I had a poem several years ago that was accepted to a journal, Hayden's Ferry Review. And the editors at Hayden's Ferry Review said, we like your poem, we don't like the last 2 lines, can we just cut them? And the artist in me is, no, you can't cut them. Those lines have artistic integrity. And then the realist in me said, yeah, let's do it. Let's publish this poem. Cool. Those 2 lines I still have. Sometimes when I think of the poem, I still think of those last 2 lines as being there. But they're editors who saw something and didn't feel like those last 2 lines fit with the poem. That's fine. They published my poem, and I was happy about that. So, does the beginning of the piece make me want to read more? I want you to think of the title and the opening line as an argument. And we're going to talk much more about titles and opening lines throughout the semester. But I want you to think about the title and the opening line as an argument. And is this argument compelling you to want to read more? Okay, so whenever you read a poem, I want you to think about it in those terms. Okay, what is this opening line of the poem doing to make me think that I should read more of it? Okay, and does the ending satisfy me? This is a really open question. I wrote this question. It's probably a terrible question because there are final endings of poems that do not satisfy me. There are times in which I've finished a poem and I'm not satisfied, but I'm okay with that because the poem was not a poem that should have left me satisfied. It was a poem that needed to keep me hungry for something in the world. And then there are other times I finished the ending of a poem and maybe it satisfied me in some sort of closure type way, but I didn't think it was appropriate for the world that the poem was creating. So does the ending satisfy me personally? But maybe another way of looking at the question is this the right ending for this poem? Does this feel like an appropriate place to begin this? The 4th section is about originality. Does this feel like something new? It should be original as much as possible. At the very least, it should not feel played out. So I don't want you to look at this and think, oh my gosh, I need to reinvent the wheel with every single poem that I write. I'm not going to stop you from thinking that, because I think I could see some amazing and kind of off-the-wall stuff if you really do have this mentality. But I'm not asking you to reinvent the wheel with every poem. What I'm asking you to do is think about how this poem is going to be different from other things that you're doing. It shouldn't feel played out. Don't write a poem that you're writing because it feels like a lot of other poems. Don't write a poem ever because it feels like this is what a poem is supposed to sound like. I read a bunch of poems about this, and so that feels like a thing that I need to write about. You can write a poem about Icarus. There's a lot of poems about Icarus in the world. You can write one, but you want to give your own angle to it. So if you're writing a poem about something that is really well discussed, you can do that, but just don't make it feel like it's all those other Icarus poems or poems about whatever topic feels a little bit over discussed. Make sure that it feels like yours. Is the poem overly sentimental? So when we talk about sentimental, I'm talking about sentiment. I'm talking about emotion that isn't earned. This is what's going to separate the work that we read, the work that we write, I hope, from the stuff of Hallmark cards. And I'm not saying that Hallmark cards and Hallmark movies don't have places in which we can feel something. But they also are kind of manipulating the thing that we're feeling. So what I want from you more is emotion that's earned. I don't want to see us relying too much on emotion that is generated because the piece has given the reader a familiarity with an emotion rather than a real emotion. What I mean is I see this Hallmark movie, I read this Hallmark card, and I feel an emotion because I've been told, hey, you are going to feel this emotion now. Here is a situation that is requiring you to feel a certain way. Now feel it. That's not earned. What you want in a poem is for the reader to feel something that they may not expect to feel. I'm not saying that's bad. I watched a lot of Hallmark movies this last holiday season. Am I proud of that? I don't know, but I watched a lot of them. But they aren't earning the emotional responses that we get, at least not often. So what you need to do is find a way to make sure that the emotional intake of the poem is earned. And if something feels sentimental, if it feels like the emotions in the poem are insincere, and if insincere is not the right word, at least not earned, then you need to go back and see if there's another way to get that across. It can be a problem because I can look at a poem and think I'm supposed to feel something because it's almost like the writer's telling me to feel something, but I don't, because that's not a sincere way to get things across. So is the poem overly sentimental, and how so? What is it doing? Is it trying to describe a situation without giving me character or feeling? Is it describing the passing of a character or a situation the character is in without really making me feel anything for the people who are there? That's what you want to be careful about. Specificity is key in a poem. And often sentimentality occurs when things get too general. So the more specific you are, the more able you are to avoid sentimentality. If I just wrote a poem about my grandfather died and I was sad, that's sentimental and that's not really going to connect with anybody. If I talk very specifically about the way that I felt in the parking lot of my drugstore job when my mom came out and called me out of the store to tell me that he had died in the hospital, and the way we clutched each other in that parking lot while cars were going by on that Friday afternoon, I can't remember. That's not sentimental. Do you see the difference? It's important. And now I have to go write that poem. I'll wait till I'm done. Next section is on storytelling. I'm using storytelling here because a lot of poems are going to have narrative vibes to them. A lot of poems are going to feel kind of like a story that's being told. No, but a lot of them will. When we read a lot of Mary Oliver, we'll see that she's a poet that relies on lyric a lot more, which is the idea of taking an image and really looking at that individual image. But there are stories within hers too, and some are very directly narrative, though not a ton. But I want to think about the way we're telling a story in our poems. So the first question is the poem dependent on a twist ending or some kind of gimmick? And I ask us to be cautious of this. I'm cautious of any story or poem in which the only way I could really get satisfaction is because of some sort of twist that occurs at the end. I think that our writing needs to be good all the way through. My feeling on spoilers in movies kind of reflects this. Now don't spoil something for me. I haven't seen Aquaman. I don't know how the heck you'd spoil that for me. But don't like start screaming the ending of movies at me. Hey, Jason, you said you didn't care about spoilers, so guess what happens in this movie? Don't do that. But what I mean is that a good movie or a good book can't be spoiled. Does that make sense? Like, if the only way I could possibly gain enjoyment from something is because of a twist that occurs in the final 5 minutes of a film, I don't really know if there was anything to begin with that. That being said, don't tell me what happens at the end of a movie before I've seen it just to be a jerk and prove me wrong. I like being surprised, but I also am cautious of situations in which everything depends upon that final turn and that final unexpected turn. So I feel that way in poems. Often there are poems that I've read in which I don't fully understand what's happening until the last line. Sometimes that can be satisfying, and sometimes it feels a little bit like a trick, and you want to be careful about that. The next question, the storytelling section, is would a well-read adult find this story interesting? I'm using the word story here, although we're talking about poems. Would a well-read adult find this poem interesting? You're writing for well-read adults. That's the way I want you to think about it. And I think some of you might have interest in writing for younger readers, and that's awesome. But I want you to think very specifically about a reasonable, well-read adult. Would there be something interesting for that person in this poem? I don't know. This is a hypothetical poem, so I'm not sure if it is or not. But that's the question that I've got. Next section, 6, characters and voice. This is a big deal in our poems. Does the speaker of the poem feel like a clearly defined figure? Do I know him or her? If there are characters and they're well defined, can I see them? Obviously, different poems are going to have different expectations for this. There might be some poems in which there's no I in the poem. A lot of poems. There's no I. There's no clearly defined speaker. But my argument is, even when there isn't an I, even when there isn't a clearly defined speaker, there still is something there. Somebody is telling us this poem. Somebody has an attitude toward the material. Somebody thought it was important enough to tell us this. When we're talking about our poems in workshop, I want you to be really careful about saying you to a writer. You know, I like the way that you said this in the poem, or in this line you say this. Yeah, there's the writer you, but there's also the speaker of the poem. And the speaker and the writer are not the same person. Even when they are essentially the same person, they're not the same person. So I want us to get in the habit of talking about the speaker rather than the writer. Because the speaker is saying the things in the poem, the writer is just allowing the speaker to say them. It might seem like a small thing, but it's not. Especially when we get into poems that are very personal, which I'm assuming some of us will write over the course of this. So even if I'm writing something that is pretty general, a poem that doesn't necessarily have a I in it, you still might be able to find a clearly defined figure within that. So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow. Well, there's no I there, but there's a speaker. Because to that speaker in that William Carlos Williams poem, there is not just a red wheelbarrow, but there's the fact that so much depends upon it. If it was just a non-important speaker, then we would just get the description of the red wheelbarrow and that's it. But I get this so much depends upon. I get a bias in terms of how much value this thing has. That's a big deal. That's a character in there. So if we have a clearly defined character, that's great, and it needs to be. If there's an implied character, well, that's okay too. Okay. And if it is a clearly defined character, do I know him or her? I don't mean literally. I mean, does this speaker feel like somebody that I can relate to and understand? Does it feel like I can see them? I ask in here also. That doesn't necessarily literally mean hair color and height and what's on the back of their baseball card or the stats that you can look up online, but do I have a sense of who they are? Who is telling this poem? This is especially relevant if it is a poem without a direct speaker. Is this the proper person to have this responsibility? Is there somebody else in this world who could look at this situation in a different way? Think about that. What personality is coming across through the speaker? Is there an urgency? Is there a sort of lackadaisical response to the poem? Is there something in between? What do we get of this speaker? 7, condensing. What can be tightened? What is getting in the way of the really important stuff? So what I'm asking for here is to think about the poem and what you can take out. I think it's really one of the most important basic things we can start with, is what in this poem does not absolutely 100% have to be there. And the way I phrase this question is, what is getting in the way of the important stuff? It's a matter of looking at the poem that you're reviewing or your own poem and prioritizing what matters most. And is there stuff that matters less that's taking up space? Probably. Don't be afraid when you are making comments on somebody's poem to suggest cuts, to suggest taking things out. The suggestions you make, number one, are not required upon the writer to follow. But also, it's nothing personal. It's just like, oh, maybe this poem works better if we take these few words out. Don't suggest taking everything out of a poem. That's mean. But looking for specific things that are there that we can remove. Okay. Are there places where the piece could be condensed in order to improve it overall? Think about what you can take out. I don't mean this in a mean way. I mean, I look at a poem and I think, okay, here's a poem that is using 10 words to describe something that could be said in 5. Think about that economy of language. What is it that this poem can do to tighten that language and make its language more economical? On the flip side of condensing it is elaborating it. What needs to be developed further in this poem? Are there things in this poem that I need more of? And while it's possible that we'll have things that we can condense in the same poem, we might have things that we need to elaborate upon. There might be places where the poet is being too wordy, but then leaving out a lot of things that would be relevant to us and our understanding of the poem. So what needs to be developed further? What do we need to make sure we get more of? Is there something that should be dealt with more fully? Perhaps something that doesn't make sense or is interesting but not developed. Did the writer mention something that he or she didn't really fully get into as it went on? Well, what is it? And what more can we do to really develop it and get it across? Well, the last section here is about the proper order. I kind of alluded to this a while ago, but play around with the order of the poem. Is the poem starting in the right spot? Is it ending in the right spot? Is there something in the middle that could be moved up? Really play around with where pieces can go. I want you to think of a poem as a puzzle that we can potentially find new meaning by moving things around. Again, this isn't a slight on the poem itself. Sometimes we have the pieces in place, but we don't have them in the right spot. So what if the piece to this puzzle were moved? How does that affect the poem? What if in a 8-stanza poem we move stanza 7 to where stanza 2 is and swap stanza 2 to stanza 7? What happens? What changes in that? What does the poem do differently as a result of that? And you will never know until you try it, until you play around with it. So in our workshops in class, there'll be times where we will read things in different ways. I'll say, okay, I'm going to read this poem again, but this time I'm going to take that 3rd stanza and I'm going to move it to the top and I'm going to cut these 2 lines in the middle. Let's see what happens. And then we'll read it aloud and we'll say, wow, that's really cool. Or, no, I liked it the other way better. That's fine. But it's important to get to play around with the order. Don't be afraid to reorganize a piece of writing to see if something even more interesting exists beneath the surface. Sometimes it feels like we're not allowed to do that, but we are. We can change things around. We can move them around. It's a beautiful thing about poems, is that we can structure them in different ways and get different meaning out of it. I had a professor that I worked with when I was in grad school who was the best line editor that I ever worked with. And what I mean by that is he could take my poem and start cutting things and making suggestions that would change everything about the poem that I was working on. He was able to cut lines out and find a really good poem inside the okay poem that I handed him. You don't do that. You don't find those things out unless you try. And so I want to make sure we're doing that for each other. We're making cuts. We're making suggestions. We're finding the really good poem that's underneath the okay poem that we're turning into workshop. So I want to have conversations about this. So if you have questions about any of this, post them in the comments below. And I can try to come back and give some feedback too. But I want to make sure we have a little bit of a conversation about this. I've given you a ton of pieces of advice. If any of this is unclear, if any of this really stands out to you, if there's something that I said that really resonates and feels like good advice, or something that you're not sure about, let me know. Just comment below and we will make sure to follow up this conversation. Until then, I got some more things that I want to talk to you about this week, and I want to get into a little bit more discussion about some of the materials that we read. But I've hoped that this has helped in making sense of this document, and I look forward to our future interactions. Thanks, everybody.